to go and deal with people who were deprived and lived at the time in deep superstition. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Albert Schweitzer, yeah. And it's a single parable that he credited with motivating and altering his life, a story that became so profound and so motivating that he made drastic changes in his life. The story was the parable that I read to you today, the parable called Parable of the Rich Man and Lazarus. When he read this story, it revolutionized his life. Anybody revolutionized by the parable? Anybody feel guilt by the parable? That's more likely, yeah. Now, the rich man and Lazarus were neighbors, right? They were neighbors. They saw each other probably every day. Not socially. They weren't social neighbors, but they had contact, at least at the gate. And we know that Lazarus ate probably out of the dumpster of the day from the rich man. And every day, the rich man saw this beggar at his gate. Who were they? Well, the rich man, it says, lived very comfortably even in his own time. He was a successful kind of guy. He was self-made. He was independent. He was, well, self-indulgent. The contrasting lifestyles between the two people in our parables couldn't have been greater. You can't miss it. The rich man was a connoisseur. He was a lover of the arts who knows and appreciates fine living. He enjoys 4-star restaurants. We're told in verse 19 that he habitually dressed in purple and in fine linen, which were rare things to find in those days and required great wealth to possess them. The other man's name is Lazarus. Lazarus is a homeless man. We're told in verse 20 that he has some kind of serious disability. Lazarus barely made it from day to day, living off the scraps of what was left over from the sumptuous feasting at the house of the wealthy man. He's just a survivor, and that's pretty much all we can say about him. According to the story, both men die. Dying is sort of the great equalizer, isn't it? Of all the social status stratifications that we have, death just eliminates them all. It doesn't care about social standing. It doesn't care about color. It doesn't care about your standing in the community. Jesus said that Lazarus was carried away by the angels to the bosom of Abraham. He sat next to Abraham in heaven, I guess. And all that Jesus says about the rich man is that he died and was buried. Now, I think that's pointed as well. I think it's strange because I would imagine that the rich man had quite the pomp and circumstance for a funeral, where Lazarus probably did not. He had sort of the pauper's grave sort of funeral, which was attended by next to no one. But the rich man probably had a very grand funeral, but Jesus says nothing about it. He just says he was buried. It would have been the kind of funeral that folks would have remembered for years, but Jesus just said he was buried. And then there's one additional fact, that he's tormented in Hades, the place of the dead. Now, it's kind of an unnerving story, isn't it? Anybody not feel a little twinge of ouch in the story when it was read today? Yeah, I can see why this kind of story would be the burr in the saddle, if you will, sort of an irritant to a man like Albert Schweitzer, and asks important questions about who he was and what he should do, and about the neighbors that he never met. Why is this story so bothersome? Well, there's a couple of things. One is it shows that there are reversals in the standards of the world, that God's interested in those kind of reversals. And we've seen this over and over throughout the book of Luke, the gospel that we're looking at this year. We see this pattern from the very beginning. We hear in the song that Mary sings when she's pregnant, called the Magnificat, about these kind of reversals, that the powerful are going to be brought low, the proud will be scattered, and the hungry will be filled, and the rich will be sent away empty. These kind of reversals are the pattern of Luke's gospel. And we find this kind of reversal written into this story. We call this the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. By tradition, we call him Dives, because I think it's hard for us not to give the rich man a name, because most of us see ourselves in the role of the rich man, rather than in the role of Lazarus. In the parable, though, only the poor man has a name. Now that itself is opposite of what the world is. How many poor people do you know by name? How many rich people do you know by name? Well, we probably know a few, don't we? Bill Gates, maybe Donald Trump. That's an obvious one today. Who else do we know? Warren Buffett. How many famous poor people do you know? You might know some, but I would think that the numbers are far less. We tend to know the names of rich people. And yet in this story, the name of the rich guy isn't added at all. It's just the poor man who is named. It's an interesting turnaround. Many of us don't know any of the homeless even in our area. We just know them as the homeless, or the poor, or the guy with the sign, or the third world, or the welfare cases. They're the neighbors we've never met. And in the way of Jesus, this preference for the rich and the powerful, which is the way of the world, is not the way of Jesus. God knows the name of every suffering person. There is a special place in God's heart for the poor. Remember that Jesus has been telling us stories about lost things. So chapter 15, there's 3 stories of lost things. He tells stories about lost things because the scribes and the Pharisees, the powerful of the day, were critiquing Jesus because he was hanging out with tax collectors and all manner of sinners. And so Jesus tells the story of the joy of lost things being found. That's chapter 15. Last week we told that really distressing parable about the shrewd manager, and grace being that dishonest wealth that God gives to us, Jesus being the shrewd manager, cutting our transgressions. But it's a parable that's told against the money-loving Pharisees. And after that parable, it wasn't part of our text, between that parable and this one is a very harsh critique of the money-loving Pharisees and scribes. And then we get this story, again told in the presence of the disciples and of the scribes and Pharisees, a parable told against someone. And in this case, it's the scribes and Pharisees. But of course, the collateral damage is to those of us in the first world, those of us who also have neighbors that we've never met. So continuing today is the story of a rich man, a rich, powerful man who has everything for self-sufficiency, and the story of a suffering poor man. Now, Jesus wants the Pharisees, his disciples, and us to see something here, something about the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is not exploitive of the poor. It's not blind to their need. It's not callous to their suffering. The rich are not categorically condemned. Anybody feel a little bit better? We should turn to Timothy, our second reading that Phyllis gave to us today, about advice as to what we rich people ought to be doing. And in this crowd, even though there's certainly stratification, we are all among the rich. And so, how are we to do this? The parable does not categorically condemn the rich. It's not just money that's the root of evil. It's the love of money that changes the way in which we look at the world. The problem with wealth is how it blinds us. We live in the Conejo Valley in a bubble. Anybody agree with that? We live in a bubble. What is that? It's a wealth bubble. And it changes the way in which we see the world. The rich in this story have a problem with justifying their wealth and affluence by saying that, well, we earned it. And not taking into account that we're a product of the luck of the DNA draw, the place perhaps that you were born, the heritage into which you were born, your genetic blessings that you received as gifts. Maybe it's good parenting that made you the wherewithal to rise. Some of us today are struggling with the concept of being introduced to something painful in the media called white privilege. White privilege just means kind of you got lucky, because in our culture that's preferenced and it dominates. It's painful for us. Living in the way of Jesus, we are neighbors to others and receive them in love as children that are also redeemed by God and who are deeply loved. With eyes opened, our position in life reassessed, we are invited to engage the world to alleviate suffering and to strive for justice. And I think that's what troubled Albert Schweitzer in this parable. Secondly, the story is troubling because the rich man is not a bad guy. Anybody notice that? He's not a bad guy. It never says that he's done anything wrong. We'd like to justify it that he's an evil man, an evil rich man. Now that would be a much more tolerable kind of parable, wouldn't it? Instead of just a kind of rich guy. But it never tells us that he kicked Lazarus away from his gate. He never chased him away. He never lectured him about getting up and getting a job. Still, that he was not a bad guy isn't enough to land him in the bosom of Abraham, in heaven, if you will. And well, that should unnerve us too. Why? Why did he do, what did he do that was so terrible that would deserve such an eternal fate? What? What did he lack? Marianne hinted at it. He acted as though it all was supposed to be that way. That he was supposed to feast sumptuously every day. That he was supposed to wear purple and fine linen. And that Lazarus was assigned a certain role and that he should be lying at his gate. That is just the way it is. It never occurred to him that the fate of Lazarus' birth and the fate of his birth could have been switched. Lazarus, therefore, became a part of suffering humanity, and he became just a part of the landscape. Now, Jesus is really messing with us here, because many of us see the landscape in the same way. In a word, the rich man was indifferent. Indifferent to his plight, indifferent to Lazarus' hunger, indifferent to his needs. They were neighbors who never met. Now, this can happen in your life when your life is not fully shaped by your faith, when you have just enough faith to think of yourself as saved, but not enough faith to be changed. What I call thin faith. Meaning only enough to make you feel comfortable about your own eternal destination, but not nearly thick enough to motivate you to strive to live out your faith within the context of a dark, suffering, violent, and needy world. Some years ago, before the death of Mother Teresa, there was a documentary. Maybe some of you have seen it. It depicted the grim human suffering that she faced in the ghettos of Calcutta. It was shown here on American television, so you can imagine when it was divvied up with commercials how that looked. The producer had interviewed her as she was making rounds in this dreadful scene. Throughout the program, it was interrupted in the flow with commercials. The sequence of topics and commercials was alarming. Lepers, bikinis for sale, mass starvation, designer jeans, agonizing poverty, fur coats, abandoned babies, ice cream sundaes, the dying, diamond watches. The irony is so apparent. Two different worlds on display right there on the television. The stark realities of one from another was jarring. The world of the poor, the world of the affluent. It seemed that the very culture here in the United States and many other places, the way we deal with commercialization is to numb us so that we never meet our neighbors. And it's easier for us to watch what's going on in the box than it is to watch what's going on at our gates. The parable invites us to come alongside of Lazarus and to see the world from his point of view. This is why we must take seriously, in our today contemporary world, the complaints of minority groups, the poor, the immigrant, the mentally ill, the suffering. Imagine if we could withhold our defensiveness for a moment and to sit with the African American community and understand what they mean by Black Lives Matter without being defensive and moving immediately to All Lives Matter. To strip the meaning out of what they're talking about and why they would have to say such a thing. What would it mean to sit with an African American neighbor and understand their perspective on how our culture works and how the privilege is shifted away from them? What if we listened to our police officers at the prime timers? We had a couple of our local sheriffs come in to talk about elder fraud and abuse, and thinking about what we ask of our police officers today. You know, one part armed militia, because anyone can buy an assault weapon, and so our police are often outgunned, and so they are one part militia. They are a paramilitary with body armor, which they wear every day. Can you imagine wearing body armor every day with automatic weapons? They're also the neighborhood watch, you know. So the officers were telling me that morning they had been talking with an older widow who had lost her cat. It was in the tree. Neighborhood watch and expectation. Somewhere between finding lost cats and maintaining safe traffic flow and protecting lives, they're also mediators of domestic disputes, right? We're asking them to be mediators as well. They're also social workers trying to deal with under-resourced homeless and the mentally ill in our population. What are we asking them to be? What are we asking them to do? Have we not often put African Americans in impossible situations? Have we not also put the police in impossible situations? We're asked to sit with the neighbor that we've never met and understand reality from their point of view. That's this parable. Let's face it, it's painful, isn't it? It's hard to look into the lives of others and to see how systems don't work. The rules that we're meant to protect, the rules that we're meant to help, that somehow doesn't fit our situation. If you've ever been to court and you realize how the law is established to protect, well, lots of things, but your thing kind of falls between the cracks, doesn't it? It doesn't always work the right way. And we can see those gaps, and it becomes very painful for us to see that. And we know in our hearts that we must do something about it, but we have no idea what to do or how to do. And so we go home and we shut the doors and we turn on that box and we get all of our social engagement and all of our information from MSNBC or from Fox TV or you name yours, whatever. I'm just trying to find some names. And we disengage from the hurting and we have ideas about that. And that's troubling because when I do that, I look a lot more like the rich man in the story than I look like Lazarus, and I miss the neighbor that I've never met. We become like the rich man. And that's bothersome when we hear the invitation of Jesus and the invitation of this parable. And yet we're tempted to be like Garfield. Remember Garfield, the cat? Remember his friend, the dog? A later introduction to Odie? There's a scene, which I was going to play this morning, but I never got time to get it up on the computer. Odie's outside. Scene is the lounge chair where Garfield is, of course, seated, and Odie's outside behind the window, and he's whimpering, and it's raining, and Garfield and Odie are having a conversation, and, oh, it's so bad out there, so I bet you went in, because Garfield's the only one that can talk. Odie can't really talk. I bet you went inside, and Garfield's just naming all the suffering that he's going through. He says, I'll solve it. Shuts the curtains. Problem solved. Do you see why this parable motivated Albert Schweitzer to ask the question about the neighbors that he never met? Jesus messes with our lives. He does. It's not our badness that draws Jesus' critique. It's our lack of acting on our goodness. It's the lack of acting on our faith when it's so obvious right before us that the faith spells it out. Jesus even says at the end of the parable, if they don't listen to the law and the prophets, they're never even going to listen to someone who rises from the dead, pointing to himself. And we don't either, oftentimes, even listen to the one who rises from the dead. We are like Garfield, shutting the curtains on the suffering of the world because, well, it's huge, isn't it? It's overwhelming. Remember, this parable is really not about the afterlife. It's a story, right? It's not really meant to describe what heaven and hell are like. He's telling the story to the living, right? It's like fable in that way. It's supposed to make a point. It's not supposed to tell us the facts about what the afterlife looks like. And Jesus wants to know, will our faith open our eyes? Will you have thick enough faith to allow God's love to open your heart? Will you walk alongside the suffering and have your head and your heart motivated to think and to feel? Get your feet motivated to walk with and your hands motivated to act. Will we live in the way of the crucified and risen Jesus? That's the invitation of this parable. The parable is a postmodern parable. You know what I mean by that? It doesn't have an ending. They're just sort of left at the scene, right? That's what postmodern means. There's no happy ending. It's not a 30-minute sitcom where at the end, the guy from hell moves to heaven. It's, that's what we do in our TV programs. But that's not the case. Jesus leaves it just hanging there like an open question. The rich man wants Lazarus to be sent from the dead to go visit his brothers because he has 5 brothers and probably some sisters too. It's a big family, and they're very wealthy. They're all trust babies, and they're all living in a way in which they cannot see their world and the reality around them. And now this man understands his reality very clearly, and he wants Lazarus to go and tell them about the fake privilege that they have. We want it to be like Dickens stories, right? It's kind of like that. I wonder if not Dickens didn't borrow a Christmas carol from this. Jacob Marley's ghost comes to Scrooge. He's carrying a long chain. And what does Scrooge do? He changes. That's how we want this story to be motivated, isn't it? But the story has not ended yet. Because the story is for you. There's a neighbor at your gate that you have never met. And you have been invited to God to see your world in a bigger way, to see the neighbors around you, both near and far. Albert Schweitzer chose to see neighbors that were quite far away from Europe. And yet, the impact of this one story changed the world. The gulf that exists between the rich man and the poor man is the same gulf in the story that will exist in heaven and Hades between the poor man and the rich man. Do we still have such a gulf between us? What if instead of just feeding the poor, and I've said this before, when we go to do the Caneo Meals program, what if we motivated to take that next step and just walked across the room? You know what I mean? Because most of the time when I've been there, I stay behind the table because it's very helpful to keep my hands busy when I'm feeling uncomfortable. But what would it be if we stepped on the other side of the table and we moved from serving others to accompanying others? Because I can tell you, when I've done that service at the Caneo Meals program, they're all still neighbors I've never met, even though I filled their plates with food. And this parable motivates us to another level of engagement. Not just serving or giving money to others, but to engagement in ways in which both of our lives can be changed. I hope this parable by our Lord bothers you as much as it bothers me. It gives us the gracious invitation to take a deeper step into faith, to have a thicker kind of faith, a more relevant kind of faith for our world. And in the name of Jesus, you can make the neighbor that you've never met the neighbor you now know. Jesus invites us into a way of life that is vital and inspiring. Jesus invites us into a way of life that is engaged and meaningful. He wants us to see in rich and in poor, in healthy and in ill, in well and in suffering. But particularly for the overlooked, He wants us to see in the neighbor we've never met the image and imprint of the eternal God, and to respond to them as if we are welcoming Christ Himself. So it will never be said by Jesus that we were the neighbors that never met, but for each of us, named and loved, it will be welcome home, finally, forever, at last. Amen.